Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this panel on the Brazil-China-US triangular relationship. I'm very happy to be here. We have Professor Daniele Ramos from University of Brasilia and Professor Eva Medeiros from Georgetown University to discuss this very important topic of how Brazil relates to these two superpowers in the current world. I'd like to remember everyone. This is a project that we have organized with the U.S. Consulate in Rio. This is one of our last seminars. We have had almost 10 seminars in the last year. We have discussed the bilateral relationship between Brazil and U.S. from many different angles, and of course we have discussed the China factor in this bilateral relationship. So for today's talk. As I mentioned, we have Professor Eva Medeiros, who is a Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies in the School of Foreign Service, and Kling Family Distinguished Fellow in U.S.-China Studies at Georgetown University in the United States, and also Professor Daniele Ramos, who is Associate Professor at the Institute of International Relations and Coordinator of the Center for Global Studies at University of Brasilia, and a specialist in China in Brazil. So this is going to last for approximately 1 hour. Everyone who may have questions, please use the chat here on your screen. I will collect the questions in the end, and I'm sure this is going to be a great debate. So thank you very much for both of you. And I first pass the word to Professor Eva Medeiros. Professor Medeiros, you have the floor. Thank you again.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. As a Portuguese American, I wish we could do this in Portuguese, but unfortunately, my language skills aren't up to par, but I very much look forward to my next visit to Brazil. And of course, with President Lula actually being in China today, the timing of this could not be better. So I congratulate CEBRI on being very timely with their events. As a specialist in Chinese foreign policy, as somebody that focuses very much on the U.S.-China relationship, and of course, as a former government official, I spent many years working for President Obama in the White House. I look at the China-Brazil-America interaction through a very, very particular lens as both a scholar and a policymaker. And I'd like to make 3 points and use those 3 points as a framework for beginning our conversation today. And the first point doesn't really have anything to do with the US, Brazil, or China, really has to do with global politics. And that is to remind everybody that the current period in global politics is a very sensitive one. It's a very fragile one. I think that we're at a turning point in global politics. I can't tell you exactly what type of turning point it is, but I can tell you that it has elements of the 1930s, elements of the 1950s, and elements of the 1970s. The 30s in the sense of a lot of rapid change in both economic affairs and security affairs that could precipitate a major disjuncture in global politics. Or it could be the 1950s, sort of the opening stages of a sort of new era of long-term competition. Or it could be the 1970s, that the international system is working through some challenges, but won't really result in any fundamental changes to the nature of the global order. As I said, I'm not sure entirely which one of those eras that we're in. We're in a very, very sensitive moment. This is why I think we're in a sensitive moment. That basically there's two global macro trends that are influencing international politics today. The first is what I call global economic fragmentation. Some people call it deglobalization. I don't like that term because I think it's too broad and too extreme. I don't think we're ever really going to go back to a pre-globalization world, but it's very clear that as a result of a variety of events, including the Russian invasion of Ukraine, US-China strategic competition, of course, COVID, that we're beginning to see a breakdown in the intensity of connectivity among countries on trade, investment, technology, people, etc. So that's why I think it's accurate to say that we've entered into a era of global economic fragmentation. I mean, look no further than the fact that there's more sanctions, there's more export controls, there are more investment restrictions. Protectionism is rising in most markets. We're talking a lot more about industrial policy, and the terms reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring are very, very common manifestations of industrial policy. So again, it's not deglobalization, but it is fragmentation in which you begin to see different groupings emerge in the global economy. So one major trend in global affairs is global economic fragmentation. How far that will go, it's too early to tell. The second major trend is global security polarization. Some people like to call that a new Cold War. I prefer the term global security polarization. And basically, the point there is you're beginning to see groupings of countries emerge with very distinct views about how the global order should operate. You have what Gideon Rachman of the FT calls the global West. So that's the United States, Europe, mostly NATO countries, and American allies and partners in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and others. So you have that grouping. And then you have China, you have Russia, Iran and North Korea are there to some degree. And then, of course, you have a group of middle powers and you have the global South. And the question is what is the relationship going to be among these three different groupings? Some of whom, you could pick European countries like France that prefer not to be part of the global West, but see themselves as a more autonomous middle power, right? So I'm not trying to say that the world is breaking up into three different blocks, but rather that there are these collections of countries with common interests and common values. The antagonism and the competition among these groupings is growing. And I think it will be the interactions among them that will really influence the degree to which international security affairs tends more toward competition and perhaps even confrontation. Of course, the drivers of this, I think, are quite evident. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, which really supercharged this notion of the global West and gave NATO and the transatlantic relationship sort of a new lease on life. You have US-China strategic competition, right, which has only antagonized the differences or brought forward the differences between the United States and China on a whole variety of issues. And I'll talk more about that in a second. You've got regional challenges, North Korea and Iran's nuclear weapon programs. And then, as I said, you have the emergence of both middle powers in the global South, which often overlap because, of course, there's some elements of the global South that are actually in the North, in the Northern Hemisphere. But nonetheless, it's global security polarization. The fact that the differences are expanding more than the areas of convergence among different power centers in the world. And so the question as a scholar of international relations is, what happens when global economic fragmentation meets global security polarization? The 30s, the 50s, the 70s. I don't entirely know the answer to that, but I can tell you that the United States, China, and Brazil will be an important part of understanding this trajectory in international politics. And so I wanted to lay that out because I think it's important to put the relationship among these three countries in the context of the era that we're in today. My second point is about the US-China relationship, right? This is a relationship I've studied as a scholar. I was very fortunate to work at the White House, sort of at the control panel of the US-China relationship for many years, working for President Obama. And what I would say is the US-China relationship, I'm sad to say, really has entered a new era. And that's an era that people commonly call strategic competition, but it's really more than that. It's strategic competition that has a variety of particular features to it. The fact that the US and China, Biden and Xi Jinping, have not been able to find any kind of formula for a stable equilibrium. Both sides talk about building a floor under the relationship and guardrails around it, but we haven't reached that point. They haven't achieved that 2 years into the relationship, and it's not clear that they're ever going to be able to do that. Number two, there are major policy challenges ahead in the relationship. So I don't see the U.S.-China relationship as just a garden variety strategic competition. I think it's a competition in which that is expanding, it's intensifying, and it's diversifying. And I think we need to take this phase of strategic competition very, very seriously. That's what sort of makes me feel like the current era in international politics is like the 1950s, in which you're seeing an acceleration in the alienation. The major policy challenges are all big and very substantial ones. Of course, there's the Taiwan issue, disputes over maritime territorial disputes in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Big differences about technology, and of course, that's an arena of competition. And then, of course, nuclear weapons, right? It's not something that is talked about enough, but the Pentagon's new estimate, public estimate, is that by 2035, so in about 10 years, China is going to triple the size of its nuclear arsenal. That has major, major implications that I think policymakers and scholars need to understand where that will drive the U.S.-China relationship. The communication channels, as these differences expand and intensify, the communication channels have atrophied very, very significantly, right? Basically, it's only when Biden and Xi Jinping talk to one another, which only happens a few times a year, that you can really solve problems or manage complicated issues. And so that's a problem when a relationship as big and complex as the U.S.-China relationship, the communication channels, the infrastructure doesn't exist to manage effectively the relationship. And as a result, what we're seeing is a relationship in which both sides are now probing and testing the boundaries of acceptable behavior, which is leading to some very dangerous activities on both sides. I would say third, the relationship is becoming deeply politicized. Public opinion in both countries toward the other is deteriorating. And so in the United States, the constituencies that often supported the relationship are now somewhere between ambivalent to negative. Unfavorability ratings among the American public toward China are at all-time highs. Favorability is at an all-time low. Criticism of China is now basically the one issue that Republicans and Democrats in the Congress agree on. It's bipartisan. And then you have groups like the U.S. business community, civil society, journalists, even universities that have become quite negative about China. So this is a relationship that's entering a new and different and much more complicated phase of strategic competition. And the risks of an accident or miscalculation are only growing as both sides begin to understand what it means to engage in what I call broad spectrum competition, right? The relationship, the competition is really about competition on security issues, economic issues, technology issues, and ideology, questions of domestic governance and global governance. So this is a serious, new, complicated phase of the relationship. And then when you have all of that and you have an issue that you can fight about Taiwan, and the Taiwan issue is militarizing, it's globalizing, it's changing, the stakes are growing. China just completed last weekend a series of exercises after the U.S. Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, met the Taiwan President, Tsai Ing-wen, during her transit in the United States. So you have an issue to fight about. So you've got means, you've got motive, you've got opportunity. So it's a very, very dangerous stage of the relationship. And if we had mechanisms like the US and the Soviets had, crisis management, crisis communication, confidence building measures, if we had those structures in place to manage it, it would be okay. So I want to use that to transition to my third and final point, which is, what does this mean for the rest of the world, including Brazil? And I think the way I think about it is it presents risks, it presents opportunities, and it presents dilemmas. So risks, dilemmas, and opportunities. On the risk side, the risks are very clear. That the risks for countries are that they get pulled into a Cold War that they don't want to get pulled into. And that's a real serious risk. But it's not just a risk. It's often made out to be a risk that comes from the United States, that somehow America is asking countries to choose. America is not asking countries to choose. Allies are not allies. We understand that by asking countries to choose, we lose the long-term strategic competition, right? The US strategy is to present itself as a supporter of a rules-based international system and to prevent countries from becoming unnecessarily dependent on China and preventing them from being coerced by China. And so, the risk for countries are how do they position themselves between the United States and China? Because China in this era of fragmentation and polarization, China in this era of expanding and intensifying US-China competition is looking for more partners internationally, right? It's aligned with Russia, but China wants more countries that can help it diminish American economic power, diminish American military power, and basically try to weaken and dilute the rules-based international system, right? De-dollarization, is just one example of that. And the question is for countries, is it really to their benefit to exist in a system where China is the second largest or largest economy? Rules and institutions like the UN and the WTO no longer guide how countries interact, but simply it's who's the most powerful. And so I think countries really are going to face even more challenges in how they position themselves as the competition between the United States and China changes. Another real risk for countries, frankly, to be very frank, and I think this is probably true for Brazil, is trade with China could increase pressures toward deindustrialization, right? I mean, China, for example, wants good, safe, reliable trading partners that aren't going to subject them to sanctions or export controls, right? This is the lesson that China learned after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So China's whole global economic strategy, one of the drivers of fragmentation, is to diversify away from those markets and those partners, the US, Europe, American allies in Asia, that could subject China to sanctions, export controls, investment restrictions, etc. And so what that means is China is going to turn to partners in Africa, Latin America, Brazil, to buy more commodities, etc. I was just looking on Bloomberg today, and about 75% of Brazil's exports to China are commodities. That's great. Obviously, that's good for Brazil and certainly helps Brazilian producers of commodities. But what it also does is it runs the risk of creating pressures toward deindustrialization when feeding China becomes a priority over moving up the value chain in terms of production, because growth at the end of the day really comes from productivity advances. Productivity advances come from innovation and moving up the value chain in terms of production, in terms of manufacturing, certainly in sectors like IT. So I think the challenges of doing business with China is the pressures toward deindustrialization. Now, I also talked about opportunities. The opportunities presented by the US-China competition is to try and encourage both countries, Beijing and Washington, not to compete in a zero-sum way, but to find areas in which they can work together as the two largest economies to solve problems, right? And so if Lula goes to Beijing and says, look, I don't want to get drawn into a Cold War between the United States and China. I refuse to choose. And there's a whole variety of problems, global problems, that will only be solved with America and China working together. But both your resources and your political will, both problems in Brazil, but also problems in Latin America more broadly, public health, emerging market debt, and of course, climate change, right? And so I think there are real opportunities there as both sides, both the United States and China, are looking toward middle powers, are looking toward the global South in sort of a competition for influence for countries in the global South to encourage the US and China not to engage in a zero-sum competition, but a positive-sum competition in which they compete to up their game, right, with Brazil or Latin America or whatever. And I would hope that President Lula would bring that kind of message and use the emphasis on middle powers in the global South in this emerging competition to get the US and China to move toward a more positive sum competition. My last point that I'll make is about dilemmas. And these are really serious dilemmas, and they're ones that I hope countries all over the world pay attention to. The first is an obvious dilemma that exists for every country, balancing interests and values, right? It's pretty obvious that China is a one-party authoritarian political system that represses ethnic and religious minorities, right? Whether it's Uyghurs in Xinjiang, Tibetans in the TAR, or even look at the crackdown in Hong Kong in 2019 and 2020. And of course, these are very sensitive issues, difficult to raise with Beijing. But the question for Brazil is, how aligned does it want to be with China, even though it's obviously a major trading and investment partner, when China is very uncomfortable with liberal values, doesn't really believe in universal values, and is seeking to undermine and dilute the liberal aspects of current global order, including major UN institutions, in favor of state-directed development strategies, single-party governance, whether it's over the internet or other issues. So that balance between interests and values, as pragmatic as policymakers like Lula may want to be, they really go to the question of Brazil's identity in the world and how Brazil wants to position itself in this evolving global order. The last dilemma that I'll point to is the dilemma between interdependence and asymmetric dependence. China's been very clear in the last 2 years that it's seeking to re-engineer its economy, right? They call it, in the 14th five-year plan, they laid out a strategy in which they seek to change relationships of interdependence into relationships of asymmetric dependence, right? The Chinese simply don't want to have economic relationships that make them vulnerable to cutoffs or pressure in the future, especially if China actually went forward and invaded Taiwan. And so, it's important as Brazil, thinks about doing more business, trade and investment with the Chinese economy, because it's big and growing, to make sure that these relationships remain relationships of interdependence and not asymmetric dependence. Because what's going to happen is you'll sell lots of things to China, but the minute Brazil does something that China doesn't like, China suddenly cuts off some of that economic assistance and waits for the political pressure to mount on the government in Brasilia to change back their policy, right? And so in some ways, China creates that economic relationship as a source of leverage that it can turn on and off in order to advance Chinese political objectives. So again, being very careful to maintain a relationship of interdependence as opposed to asymmetric dependence. Look, I put a lot on the table. Hopefully this will get us started, and I look forward to Professor Ramos's excellent comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Medeiros. A very good presentation. I really like the way you put it, like dividing how Brazil can see risks, dilemmas, and opportunities with the U.S.-China bilateral relationships. So we have approximately 100 people between here and on YouTube. It's a pleasure to have you all. Now I pass the word to my colleague, Professor Daniele Ramos from the University of Brasilia. It's a pleasure to have you here, Professor Ramos. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here with Professor Ivan Medeiros. We'll focus on these triangular relations. During the last 25 years, I've been studying Brazil-China relations, but of course, also comparing with Brazil-US relations. And in this sense, we have to pay attention not only to the systemic system and perspective and level of analysis, but also we have to pay attention to internal politics in Brazil and China, foreign policies, especially Brazil's foreign policy, since I've been working with Brazilian documents, and also international politics, as Professor Ivan has explained. I will focus more on foreign policy and Brazilian foreign policy and Chinese foreign policy towards Brazil, and how Brazil and China are reacting to US, especially Brazil is reacting to US in this third term of Lula's government. So first of all, we can see that also Brazil and China have some 4 specific goals in their relationship. I can affirm that Brazil has these 4 objectives in its relations with China, and I will list them. It's a strategic alignment and strengthening of Brazil-China relations. Of course, Brazil also wants to strengthen its relations with US. Since in the last decades, US has not been very present in the region compared to China. That's the main critic of Brazilian foreign policy's analysis. We can see that by electoral campaign lists or objectives. The second goal would be expanding the frontiers of bilateral cooperation. As we can see in Lula's visit to China, the symbolic 2020 agreements that will be signed during this visit. I have heard that there were more agreements, but they limited to 20. And there were not so many agreements signed between Brazil and US during Lula's visit to US at the beginning of the year. Of course, we are here to discuss in a comparative way this relationship. Of course, we know that US is the biggest investor in Brazil and China is the biggest trade partner of Brazil, and that US is here for many decades. We celebrate decades and decades of very important relationship between Brazil and US. And the next year, we are going to celebrate 50 years of Brazil-China official relationship. And there is only one relationship that can compare to Brazil-US relations. Those relationships are those with China, and for the last 50 years. So, but of course, US has its place in Brazil's foreign policy, and I'm here just to compare how far China has gone in its relation with Brazil in the last decades. The third point would be intensification of multilateral consultation, and I would put forward what has happened in the last hours in Brazil-China relations inside BRICS. Dilma Rousseff in the presidency of BRICS is very symbolic. Dilma Rousseff has a very important place in Brazil's history. And I think this is a political moment, very important political moment inside BRICS that can lead to very important technical decisions. And the first speech of Dilma Rousseff in her inauguration is very, well, it can indicate what is going to happen. And I'm going to talk about that. And the fourth point is the building of a solid foundation between the two societies. We can still say that there are very few Brazilians that speak Chinese, even though this has been changed in the last decades, in the last years. We don't really know a lot about China's foreign policy or China's strategy, and we need to learn more about each other. So there are a lot of homework to be done, even though there are many specialists in China's foreign policy, China international politics in Brazil since the last 10 years, 15 years at least. So there has been many changes in Brazil's perspectives about China. And of course, we know there are many specialists in US foreign policy, US-Brazil relations. And I think that our academy is paying attention much more in China and of course, US in the last years. So when we think about strategic alignment and strengthening of Brazil's China relations, we think about the objective of having more and more high-level contacts. Professor even said that China and US representatives meet sometimes during the year. So, of course, Brazil and China's high-level contacts are not as frequent as China-US contacts, but this is an objective in this new government. Of course, in the last 4 or 5 years, we didn't have this objective since there were many many frictions between the two governments. And the second objective would be to have more political confidence between the two governments. And the third would be exchange and mutual learning, especially government, enterprises, and social-to-social learning that will be necessary, especially, as Professor Evans said, facing these great movements in the systemic level, economic, strategic, and political changes. So we can say that since the last 3 months, Brazil has recovery or is trying to recover its place in the international arena. This is the main objective of this beginning of this Lula's government term, third term. So President Lula is seeking to recover Brazil's place on the international scene and raise relations with the two main world powers to the highest level. I'm talking about China and the US. So US and China are the main Brazilian partners, the main investor and trading partners. So this is the first message President Lula sent to the world. We want.
Daniele, I think your mic went muted.
I'm sorry. So I think that the Lula's government wants its place back in the scenario, in the main scene of the world, and of course take Brazil, China, and Brazil-US relations to the top of its agenda, and seriously saying, I think that this is very traditional in Brazilian foreign policy to balance and to have diversification of its relations and not be dependent on China or the US, and of course try to balance any kind of pressure. And of course, Professor Ivan Medeiros said that Brazil could face China's pressure, China's dependence, economic dependence, but in Brazil's history, we have also faced Brazil's dependence toward the US. Maybe we are changing dependency, maybe we're facing double dependency, but I'm sure that if China becomes something very hard to deal, Brazil will try to find other partners, even though China and the US will be the main partners of the system, and Brazil could not avoid them, or at least try to balance between them or with a third or fourth country. And as we have seen in the first three months of this government, Lula da Silva will restart or relaunch regional integration, regional cooperation, and of course relations with other countries in Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, and of course Europe and the US. So when we talk about high-level context, Lula's visit to the US right at the beginning of the government and Joe Biden's support for Brazilian democracy and environmental policies, with signaling financial support, are clear signs of the possibility of maintaining strategic alignment with the US in key areas of high interest for Brazil. Lula's visit to China before the third month in office and Xi Jinping's support for the expansion of trade, investment, and financial transactions between the two countries also generate expectations of deepening relations in the economic area and projects of sustainable development. Marina Silva in the US, in China, is saying that environment is top of agenda, as well as trade, investment, and financial support. And there are many signs of what is going on, and we will have to follow the visits and the documents. And so when we talk about this other objective of expanding frontiers of bilateral cooperation, of course, traditional areas, but also new points of context: digital, science and technology, innovation, poverty reduction, environmental protection, disaster mitigation, and public health. Knowing that Lula da Silva agenda is social, economic, and not necessarily political, strategic agenda. So I think that the bilateral relation and also the relation with the US will follow this social economic agenda. And I think that the traditional areas also they have frictions and problems to be solved, old problems to be solved. So we are talking about exports of agribusiness products and minerals, export of Embraer aircraft, relaunch of CEBRI satellites. Those areas will be signed, will be discussed during Lula's visit to China. So Lula is retaking old projects with maybe a new phase, but old projects are on the table. But there are new points of growth, as I said, cutting edge technology to contribute to research on science and technology. So those are agreements that are going to be signed is a kind of objective that Lula da Silva, two last governments didn't succeed to make advancements or to change in Brazil-China relations. So there are lack of science and technology progress in this relationship. There are dependency in very few agribusiness, agricultural minerals products exported. And of course, Brazil has surplus in this trade relationship. This is what China insists to affirm, that Brazil takes advantage of this relationship. So I think these agribusiness frictions will continue, and we have to add the fact that the agribusiness sector is still very linked to the last government. This explains why Lula's government has supported more than 100 agricultural or entrepreneurs to go to China with him in order to make new links, new contacts, and support from the agribusiness sector that supported the former government, the last government. So in order to have time for discussion, I will summarize just saying something about BRICS. So Dilma Rousseff said that she intends to promote the financing of projects in local currencies, and that she will seek to establish robust financial alternatives to the dollar. So maybe this is a provocative assumption. This idea was also defended by Lula at the ceremony that happened today. So Lula said, why can't we do our trade backed by our own currency? Who decided this? It was the dollar. We need to have a currency that transforms countries into a slightly more peaceful situation, because today a country needs to run after the dollar to export. So Lula da Silva tried to exchange products with China using its own currency and China currency since 2009. This is not a new policy. This is not new politics with China. So he's trying to relaunch a policy that he could not implement in the past. And symbolically, it means that maybe the Brazil's government will try to balance between the two countries, balance between US, Europe, or other countries in Asia, in order to attain its own objectives or national objectives. And this is not going to be easy. So we will have to observe and work hard. So there's still a lot of mutual ignorance and false impressions about the goals of both partners. It is necessary to better understand the objectives and strategies used side by side. It is important to avoid choices that could compromise political autonomy and economic dependence and technological development, especially in times of political tensions and intensification of global economic disputes, as Professor Evan Medeiros have so well explained to us. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward for the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hammes. Thank you for your presentation. I really like the historical perspective that you put on in this trilateral relationship, especially with the Brazil-China relationship. So to our audience, anyone who wants to pose a question, just please write a question here in the Q&A. I have a set of questions myself for both our presenters. So I'm going to start here just to break the ice. Like I've been teaching international relations for over 20 years. When I started as an undergrad in international relations, and my priority was since the beginning to study Brazil's foreign policy. The entire foreign policy of Brazil was about trade, investments, and how can we enter the globalization era of the 1990s and the 2000s. Right? So now when I teach my students about international relations, the priorities of Brazil's foreign policy, I tell them right from the start that if they're going to continue to work with Brazil's foreign policy, they have to study the US-China growing rivalry and its impact on Brazil's foreign policy. This is going to be a key dimension of Brazil's foreign policy for the next 10 to 20 years. And it's one of those key moments in history that you have. Brazil has to reposition itself in a situation not seen before, right? So in this regard, I just going to make some commercial about myself. I wrote a piece on CEBRI journal with my colleague Hussein Kalut about Brazil's possible strategy vis-a-vis the US-China rivalry. And we defend a type of foreign policy that is very common to many middle powers in the world, especially those who are very close to a superpower, that is called a hedging strategy. This name comes from the business sector, from the financial sector. You make a hedge in your investments to protect yourself. And I think Professor Medeiros' distinction between risks, dilemmas, and opportunity talks a lot about to this paper and to my worries about Brazil's position in the world. So in this paper, what we try to come up with is a set of tactical strategy in which Brazil can turn risks into opportunities. But for that, you have to have a very sophisticated and capable Minister of Foreign Affairs and political leadership in Brazil that can extract from both countries mainly economic gains, social gains, and technological gains that can only be offered to Brazil exactly because they're competing. Right? I think Professor Daniela mentioned that for the last 10 years, Latin America didn't see the United States have a very active Latin American foreign policy, not only for the last 10 years, you can say the last 30 years. Maybe the last time in the US had a very active foreign policy in the region was the 1960s. In the 1960s, one of the reasons that the US was doing that because the Soviet Union was increasing its influence in Latin America. So now it's China doing that. So US has to react. It has no alternative to react to China's influence in Latin America and also in Brazil. I tend to read this visit of Lula to China more as a compensation from what happened during Bolsonaro administration. Brazil was so far away from China than an actual foreign policy, anti-American foreign policy, like a pro-China and also anti-American foreign policy at the same time. So my question to you is like, so how do you see a strategy for Brazil, for a country like Brazil and many others, that have some tools to leverage one country against the other, to use China and a closer relationship with China to extract from the United States some offers in terms of economic and technological gains, and vice versa. And I think for a country like Brazil, this is very important because Professor Medeiros and also Professor Ramos, they pointed out to something that is very important for us and is a complicated issue in Brazil, which is dependence, both political and economic dependence towards one of the superpowers. We had that towards the US in the past. We managed to escape from that in the last 30 years. And now we might be following into a trap with China more or less in the same level. So my question to both of you, and I would like to start with Professor Medeiros if possible. So how do you see a strategy in which a country like Brazil can play one superpower against the other? Is it too risky, or Brazil has to have a different strategy, which is to avoid having a closer relationship with these two superpowers? And then I'll pass to Professor Medeiros, then I'll pass to Professor Ramos. Professor Medeiros, please.
Well, thank you. It's an excellent question. I would say first, this is a very common strategy among middle powers, right? This is what they do, right? They try to extract maximum concessions from both without aligning. So I would say that the logic of your strategy makes a lot of sense. Number two, it's very, very, very hard to do because both sides, in this case, the US and China, know exactly what you're trying to do, right? And you know, and so want to lock you in as opposed to let you just play both sides off of one another, right? Number three, oftentimes it's very difficult to do this simultaneously as opposed to sequentially. And what I mean by that is these strategies in theory work best when you can do both simultaneously. Talk to Beijing and talk to Washington, get the best deals from both, right? But the reality is that very little in international affairs sort of is that easy. it often occurs sequentially. So you do something with Washington, you sort of get what you want from Washington, and then you go to Beijing. But Beijing, knowing what you're doing, may not give you what you want, and Washington may walk away knowing you're doing exactly what you're doing. So it requires a very, very high degree of sophistication, expertise, nimbleness. And to be very frank, most democracies, including the United States and perhaps Brazil's democracy, politics often make it very, very difficult to execute these strategies. So they work on paper in theory, but actually executing them in a way that is politically sustainable at home can be very, very difficult to do. Last and final point is these kinds of strategies, the devil is always in the details. So what exactly are we talking about? What is it that you want from the United States that you're going to leverage your ties with China to get, and sort of vice versa? Is it, investment issues? Is it trade issues? You know what I mean? So it's very difficult to talk about these kinds of strategies in generalities. The specifics really, really matter. Because, we were talking before the event started that Lula went and visited the headquarters of Huawei, right? That's like waving a red flag in front of the US Congress, right? Which could create all sorts of complications for US-Brazil trade relations, right? So is Lula's strategy now to come out publicly and say, okay, I'm not going to buy anything from Huawei in order to get more from the United States? Well, if he does that, he's going to piss off, the Chinese. So the devil is in the details. Be very careful how you proceed. Professor Ramos?
Thank you, Professor Medeiros. Professor Daniele, please.
Thank you. When we go to the national level, when we go to the enterprises, economic, investment, trade level, we can see how this competition is happening day-to-day life in Brazil. I think it's very difficult to make pressure in the governmental level, government to government. Brazil has this task during the whole history, and it's very difficult to make pressure in China or over the US. So this does not really work very well. But when we go to the national level, we see that the attractions Brazil has is the main objective of competition. So in this sense, Brazil is getting more and more attractive in terms of business. That's why when Lula's government pressure saying that it's gonna, make trade using yuan or real instead of dollar, it's sending a message to China and as well as to the US, not only to the US. It's saying that the competition is on because Brazil is getting more active, it's not taking a side as Bolsonaro government did. So in this sense, I think even during Bolsonaro's government, the 5G competition was favorable to China, even though the government was very rude towards China, and it was, of course, under US pressure. So in this sense, I think that economic has its own logic. Of course, it's under political pressure, but it has its own logic. And in this sense, I think that Brazil is getting opened and is getting, again, more prepared to participate in those competitions, especially investment in infrastructure, investment in electric energy sector, of course, investing in sustainable economic projects. And in this sense, I think that Brazil could have some advantage in putting not only US and China, but also European countries in competition in its own market. And of course, there are risks to go to Russia and talk to Putin and go to Xi Jinping and talk about Xi Jinping's 12 points of peace project to Ukraine. This is very many risks, and I think this is okay. It's self-sovereign profile of doing presidential diplomacy. We understand, but it's really risky, and maybe there will be not real results. But at least they are sending the message that they are more active. They are putting people to compete inside Brazil's domestic market. and that, of course, if China doesn't give what Brazil needs or want, maybe they're going to ask other countries, even the US, and I think that the US, even though officially US has not put Brazil and Latin America, Brazil in particular, but Latin America in general, in its first place in foreign policy, in day-to-day life, they're competing with China in port sector, in electric energy sector, in technological areas, especially, and in third countries, in third markets, when we talk about minerals, when we talk about some agricultural sectors. And I think that, of course, it's a tough moment for everybody, but Brazil as a middle power will try not to lose the opportunities to get what it wants, especially in the economic, financial, commercial sectors.
Thank you, Professor Ramos. I agree with you 100% on the issue of Ukraine and Brazil's position on that matter. We received a question here from a journalist, Rafael Vasquez from Valor Econômico. Valor Econômico, Professor Medeiros, is the equivalent of the Wall Street Journal, I think, in Brazil. And he's making a question about the de-dollarization of the trade between Brazil and China. Professor Ramos reminded us that this is what Lula today in Shanghai mentioned that he would like to increase the trade, the use of yuan and real in Brazil in the trade, but like bypassing the US dollars. Professor Daniela reminded us this is since 2009. I think now in 2023, Brazil has we have more, I mean, it can work better. We have China has yuan is turning into a more global currency than when you compare to 2009. It's almost I mean, the US dollars is still by far predominant on trade worldwide. This is just a minor change in this current scenario that might lead to something bigger for yuan, the Chinese currency in the future. So I'd like to hear from both of you your view on that. And how do you think that U.S. government, this is what the journalist Rafael asks us, how do you think the U.S. government will react to that in the short term and in the long term? So Professor Medeiros first, please.
Okay, thank you. My general view is this effort by Brazil and China is largely symbolic, very risky for Brazil, and will have very little impact on this agenda of de-dollarization. The reality is whether you look at the dollar as a percentage of global reserve currencies, or the dollar in trade settlement, or the dollar in sort of SWIFT payments globally, the dollar is somewhere between 60 to 80% of all metrics, right? The renminbi is maybe 2 to 3%. So for Brazil to agree to this with China is largely symbolic. It's not really going to advance de-dollarization, but it helps Xi Jinping promote this view of expanding the circulation of the renminbi. But the reality is all that's happening is Brazil will have more renminbi in Brazilian banks. The renminbi is not a freely tradable currency, right? There are substantial capital controls. The Chinese financial system, specifically the banking system, is full of systemic risk. Ask the World Bank, ask the IMF, ask the BIS, all the major institutions know this, right? And so you have, you're just exposing yourself to risk largely for political and symbolic purposes. So I understand why Lula wants to do it, because it's part of this effort to promote more multipolarization and de-dollarization. But in terms of the real world financial implications, it's really just exposing the Brazilian economy and the Brazilian financial system to all the risks, and there are many in the Chinese financial system. Dr. Ramos?
Okay, I would say that I was in Washington, D.C. for postdoc research in 2015, 16, and I met a friend from World Bank, and she said that Chinese speech inside World Bank with colleagues from the World Bank was only about yuan presence in financial system, in taking the place or having a place with dollar in the financial system. So this is an objective China is pursuing, is following for a long time, and I think it's going to follow for the next years, the next decade. When we think about China, we don't think about short term. We think about something that China will attain in the next years, maybe in the next decade or in 20 years. But it's not gonna, they're not going to stop that. And I think this is the beginning. This is not. I agree totally with Professor Medeiros that this is not going to work as announced, but this is the beginning of a process that can work in the next years. If China continues to grow, if China continues to take more place, not only in trade, investment, but also the financial system. We know that there are lots of interference of China's government in the financial system, in its monetary system, and its objective of many criticism. But this is something that is happening, and maybe the results will be seen in the next years. And the last comment is about exchange. I think that when Brazil's government accept to use yuan inside BRICS or inside some specific trade, it's something that Brazil will ask something back. So it's a exchange politics between countries. And if I give you something, maybe you give something for me. Though I think this is part of bargaining system between China and Brazil, China and other countries from the system, since this is something very important for China's government. So I think that Brazil is making some concessions, financial, political, and of course there are risks. But of course that I think that something back Brazil will ask towards or from the Chinese government. But I agree with Professor Ivan Medeiros that there are risks, even though the Lula's speech and is that this will reduce costs, this will facilitate costs, this will open the financement system for other business between Brazil and China. And I think that the government is looking more to the benefits than the risks of using yuan or real in the exchange between the two countries. But in my perception, we should pay attention and see what's going to happen in the next years. That's it. Thank you.
Can I just add, it's important to keep in mind, China's central bank is not independent, not even remotely. So what happens when in the future, if the central bank decides to depreciate the renminbi 5%, 10%, because they need that in order to manage their internal debt problem, right? All of the holders of renminbi globally just take a massive haircut overnight with absolutely no control. So exposing yourself to a highly managed currency of an authoritarian single party system, there are serious risks.
Thank you, Professor Medeiros. We're heading to the end of our panel. It's 2 minutes to 7 o'clock here in Brazil. We receive another question. We can finish with this one. I think it's more to Professor Medeiros, which is one of the reasons that one of the perceptions in Brazil is that the U.S. today, especially the Biden administration, doesn't have much to offer to Brazil to counter the Chinese offers of this specific visit of Lula in terms of economics and trade, even the funding of the Amazon fund that President Biden promised, the Chinese tripled the amount of money. What we sometimes see here is that the U.S. works in a different way. It's a more private investment, depends on how the companies react and then the government itself. But in the Brazilian media, the way that the Chinese pose itself at offering so many deals with Brazil is often seen as in a very positive fashion. So the question is what does the U.S. today have to offer to Brazil in terms of economic or political gains to counter what the Chinese is doing? So Professor Medeiros, what's your perception on that? Thank you.
It's a very good question. It's a very fair question. I put it this way. I dispute the premise of the question. Just because Brazil does something with China doesn't mean America needs to respond. There's no zero-sum relationship between Brazil, China, and the US and Brazil. Not at all. I'm sure there are dimensions of Brazil's trade and investment relationship with China that are good for Brazil, and the US doesn't feel that it needs to counter. So I think that it's important not to see this triangular relationship in zero-sum terms. I'd put it this way. The US-Brazil relationship is just structured in a totally different way than China-Brazil. Comparing the two is comparing apples and oranges. In fact, they're not even really the same. They're not even, one's a fruit, one's a vegetable, maybe, right? I mean, the US relationship with Brazil, is based on strong historical and cultural ties, right? Obviously, we have a robust trade relationship, not as big as Brazil's relationship with China. We've got a very robust investment relationship. We have common regional challenges in the Americas, as partners in the Americas, that we need to work on. We have common global challenges, and I know the United States often looks to Brazil for its leadership in a variety of different global forums. Deforestation and climate change come to mind. So to me, the US-Brazil relationship just has so many different layers to it. It's not just a transactional relationship. It's not just about what's the latest trade deal or what's the latest investment deal, right? It's about building and expanding sort of a very, very long-term partnership. Whereas the China-Brazil relationship is very transactional. And as I said, and evidence in recent years proves this, trade and investment with China works great until you do something that the Chinese don't like, and then they cut it off, right? So it's a very, very transactional type of approach. And so, as I said, it's, the Brazil-China relationship will have a variety of risks, dilemmas, and opportunities. So I think it's just important not to try and compare the two one for one, not to use a zero-sum type of framework for thinking about the two relationships. It's probably the best, from my perspective, the healthiest way to begin thinking about how the triangular relationship might operate.
Thank you, Professor Medeiros. Professor Ramos, I give the floor back to you for your final comments, and then we close up the panel. Thank you.
Okay, I would just complete saying that US has historical, cultural advantages in its relations with Brazil, but China's politics are very patient. So they have this patient capital coming to Brazil. So I think this creates a balance between Brazil, China, and US relations. And that's why they are competing for spaces in Brazil's economy. Of course, Brazil's politics and strategic vision of the world. And but that's just to agree with some comments Professor Medeiros has said about US-Brazil relations and China's place in Latin America. So I would like to thank CEBRI for the invitation, Feliciano for the mediation, and Professor Medeiros for being here with me, exchanging those ideas. We've learned a lot, and I hope we have another opportunity for being here together. Thanks for the audience, for the questions, and looking forward to meeting you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ramos. The pleasure is mine. I'd like to thank both our panelists for being here with us, Professor Medeiros from Georgetown University and Professor Ramos from University of Brasilia. I'd like to remember everyone, this is a partnership between this panel is sponsored by the US Consulate of Rio. We're going to have our closing ceremony of this project on the 25th of this month of April. Will be an online conference again. And thank you very much for the audience. We still have almost 100 people here with us, and I see you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.